Hello, my name is Anna Egan Smucker, and I live right here in West Virginia. I love books. I love to read them, I love to write them, and I love to share them. And today I'm happy to be sharing one of my stories with you. It's a West Virginia story. It's a very special story about something very special, this apple. And this is not just any old apple. This is a golden, delicious apple. And it grew for the first time ever in the whole world right here in West Virginia. So it's called Golden Delicious, a Cinderella apple story. I called it a Cinderella apple story because just like the prince was trying to find Cinderella, there were two men, Paul and Lloyd Stark, who owned a nursery. Now, a nursery is a place that sells trees, bushes, flowers. Well, Paul and Lloyd Stark were searching for an apple that would be so wonderful, so delicious, so great that it could be crowned queen of the apple world. So now I'd like to read my story to you, Golden Delicious, a Cinderella apple story. The illustrator is Kathleen Kemly. The publisher is Albert Whitman and Company. It was apple season in the fall of 1905, and the Stark Brothers nursery in Louisiana, Missouri was flooded with apples. They were sent by farmers who hoped they had grown the world's best new apple, one the Stark Brothers would want to sell to all their customers. I feel like the prince who tried a glass slipper on one smelly foot after another to try to find Cinderella, Paul Stark said to his brother Lloyd. Paul had just tasted another disappointing apple that sure had looked like royalty. But all of those disappointments didn't stop the Stark brothers from dreaming about finding the perfect apple, one that could be crowned queen of the apple world and bring them fame and fortune. Meanwhile, miles and miles away in the hills of West Virginia, Anderson Mullins was inspecting his new farm. It had been a hot summer, and everything was as dry as dust. He hadn't reckoned on coming face to face with a miracle. "Holy cow!" he exclaimed. There in the midst of his dried-up apple orchard was a glorious green-leaved tree, its branches loaded with shining golden apples. He snapped one off and he took a bite. Never had he tasted an apple so sweet, so juicy, so gosh darn delicious. For the next 8 years, during wet seasons and dry seasons, Anderson Mullins's tree produced bushels and bushels of those golden apples. Every time he entered them in the Clay County Fair, they won blue ribbons. Each year, his tree produced fruit when other trees didn't. Come springtime, when the other apples that had been in his fruit cellar all winter were wrinkly and dried out, his golden apples were still fresh and sweet. He was sure they were like no other apples in the whole wide world. So, in the spring of 1914, Anderson Mullins searched his fruit cellar for the 3 most perfect golden apples he could find, and he sent them to the Stark Brothers nursery. He knew the Starks were always on the lookout for new and better kinds of fruit, and he was hoping for some extra dollars in his pocket. By and by, the apples arrived. Mullins yellow seedling samples, Paul Stark read, blowing sawdust off the card. "Don't waste your time on them," his brother Lloyd muttered. "Yellow apples don't sell. Tough skin, bland taste, they don't keep well." But Paul had just bitten into a slice. "Lloyd, Lloyd," he yelled, and he shoved a piece of apple in his brother's mouth. "Taste, this. Juicy, said Lloyd. Crisp and spicy, said Paul, even though it's at least 6 months old. This can't be a yellow apple, Lloyd exclaimed. It's not, said Paul, his smile bigger than a giant slice of watermelon. It's not a yellow apple, it's a golden apple. This just might be our Cinderella, shouted Lloyd. Paul Stark found it hard to wait till the next apple harvest season. When fall finally came, he traveled hundreds of miles to see that golden apple tree. First by train, then by horseback over winding mountain roads, he reached Odessa, West Virginia. The sun poured down, hot as apple butter just out of the kettle. His white shirt stuck to him, tighter than the skin on a grape, but he didn't care. At last, on a dusty country road along Porter's Creek near Odessa, Paul saw a mailbox that said A.H. Mullins. He knew his journey was almost at an end. No one answered when he knocked on the door, so he set out on his own to find Mullins's orchard and its extraordinary tree. Paul wasn't used to hills as steep as those in Clay County, West Virginia. Sweating and gasping for breath, he climbed and climbed. At first, he found only some scraggly old trees, but then he saw it. A tree with rich green leaves, its branches bent to the ground with the weight of a great crop of gorgeous, glowing, golden apples. Paul couldn't help himself. It was as if his hand reached out all by itself and plucked one. He was biting into it when a farmer came striding down the hill toward him. "My name's Paul Stark," Paul told the farmer. "That's some apple." "Name's Mullins," the farmer said. "I sent you some." "I know," Paul said, "and I would like to buy that tree from you." So the two men put their heads together and they agreed on a price. Paul Stark hired workmen to build a cage to protect the tree from animals and thieves. He even ordered a wire strung from the lock cage to a battery-powered burglar alarm in Anderson Mullins' kitchen. When Paul Stark left Mullins' farm, he took a bundle of twigs from the golden apple tree with him. In early spring, those twigs were grafted onto some of the Stark brothers' apple trees. They were cut into the stems and wrapped tight so the two would grow together. Paul and Lloyd watched over them as if those grafted trees were hens getting ready to lay golden eggs. Those young trees grew quickly. It wasn't long before beautiful golden apples filled their branches. And what did Paul and Lloyd Stark name their apples? That was easy. Golden Delicious. In 1919, Golden Delicious won a medal for the world's best new apple. You might say it was crowned queen of the apple world. So this is a true story, a West Virginia story. In the back of the book, I put a 2-page author's note where I explained a bit more about how that amazing apple happened. So I would like you to imagine that it's springtime. Fruit trees are covered with blossoms, and you see honeybees going from blossom to blossom, tree after tree. And when they're down in those blossoms, sucking out the nectar in the blossoms, those bees get covered with, and I'll bet you know this, pollen. Well, apple experts say that a bee probably became covered with pollen from a Grimes golden apple blossom. And then it flew over to a different apple tree, a golden rennet apple tree, and pollinated one of those blossoms with the pollen from the Grimes golden apple tree. Well, that blossom developed into an apple, In the autumn, it fell to the ground, and one of the seeds from that apple grew into a tree that produced the golden, delicious apple. That happened in Clay County, West Virginia, on Anderson Mullins Farm. So every September, Clay County has a Golden Delicious Apple Festival where they celebrate that amazing fruit. And it's no wonder that the Golden Delicious Apple is the state fruit of West Virginia. It's amazing to me to think, and this is true, that every Golden Delicious apple in the world, whether you would buy that apple in China or Australia or France or Mexico, it would be descended from that one Golden Delicious tree that grew in Anderson Mullins' orchard on that steep hillside in Clay County, West Virginia, over 100 years ago. So thank you for letting me share my story, Golden Delicious, a Cinderella apple story with you. I hope you hear many wonderful stories read aloud. I'm standing here as an author because I was read aloud to when I was a young child. My aunt lived right across the street from a library, and she would take me there, and we would come back to her house loaded down with books that she would read to me, my favorites over and over again. And hearing books read aloud made me want to be a reader. And being a reader made me want to be a writer. So I hope that you hear many wonderful stories read aloud, and I hope you visit one of my favorite places, the library, and that you find and enjoy books that you can read yourself. So enjoy, enjoy.